Hi there. This video is going to be a lot more theory. I'm not going to talk about specific composition rules you can apply to your photos, like the rule of thirds, rule of odds, frame within frame, leading lines, triangles. No. Instead, I'm going to take a step back and we're going to talk about how these rules came to be. I'm going to talk about how to think about composition and what you need to pay attention to when you are composing your own photos so that you can create your own unique photos without following the same specific rules that everybody else is following. The first thing you want to do is decide what your main subject is. First of all, yes, you can have multiple subjects, but in most cases, especially food photography, you'll want to pick only one. Pick the one thing that you want to highlight, the one thing you want your viewers to focus on, the one thing that is more important than everything else. For example, let's say you're photographing for McDonald's and you're photographing a meal. Now there's going to be hamburgers, there's going to be fries, there's going to be the cup of Coke, and all of those are important parts of the meal. But you want to pick one, and in this case, that will probably be the hamburger. Now, you might ask, what about those food photos that utilize patterns and they're just repeat of the same subject? Well, on one hand, you could argue that there's multiple subjects, and all of them are the main subject. What I would like to argue is that the whole entire image, the whole, is one main subject. Because think about it. It's not the individual cookie or the individual hot dog that you want your viewers to focus on. It's the image as a whole. It's when they put together and when they're in a pattern that you find that the image becomes interesting. And that's your subject. Once you pick your main subject, you can then decide how you want your composition to complement it, to highlight it. And that's the importance of picking a main subject up front. Say you have this cup of coffee right here. You've decided that this is your main subject. Now, all of those composition rules you've heard about, leading lines, now you know when the leading lines, they should converge on this subject. Maybe like rule of thirds, you've heard rule of thirds. Now you know where to put the subject at the third. Say you heard frame. Now you know that you want to frame this main subject. Or let's say you have to photograph a meal for a restaurant, a plate of pasta and a bowl of soup. If you decide that the plate of pasta is the main subject, then you can now make a conscious decision to make the plate of pasta bigger and the bowl of soup smaller. You can now make a conscious decision to place the pasta in the middle and the bowl on the side. Picking a main subject gives your composition a direction and a purpose. And this leads us to the idea a lot of photographers like to call the eye's journey. How easy is it for your viewer to identify and focus on your main subject? Where do your viewers' eyes start and where do they end? Where are they supposed to end? Your job is to tell them through the photo how to view your photo, how to view your image, how to view your work. Because if you think about it, when you're looking at a photo, you're not looking at it as a whole. You only focus on individual parts and your eye is going very fast, wandering, scattering the whole entire image, scanning it, and then processing in your brain. Try now with this video. Try to focus on my face. It's hard, right? You can only really focus on my eye, one eye, or my nose, or my mouth, but you can't focus it on the whole entire face without moving your eye around. Your goal is to make the eye's journey fluid and straightforward. You do not want your viewer's eyes to be scattering all of the photo looking for the main subject. And you know, that's where leading lines come in. They show your viewer where to start and where to end, just like arrows. It's also why we have the rule of odds. With 3 objects, it's easy to pick one and realize the 2 other subjects are not the main subject. 2 objects or 4 objects, our eyes are easily bouncing between 2 groups. And that can actually be good. That can be good, you know, for street photography, where you want to show the interaction between multiple subjects. But for food photography, no, not so much. Now, not all photos you'll be able to incorporate leading lines, and it might seem unnatural to do so sometimes, which is why it's important to know that most people, especially Western countries, scan an image from left to right, just like most people from Western countries read a book from left to right. And so ideally, in most photos, you want to leave some space on the left and cut off the image on the right. Like these noodles. The left space is free for your eyes to enter, and it stops when the image ends with the cloth. Flip it around and it looks a little off, right? Now let's talk about our third concept, a photo's balance. How to balance the weight of each component in your composition. I'll explain what contributes to a component's visual weight soon enough, but first of all, let's talk about the principle. The principle is that if you divide your image into 2 halves, the right half should be just as heavy or heavier than the left half. Why do I say the right side can be slightly heavier than the left side? That goes back to the notion that most viewers scan an image from left to right, so more focus, more visual weight will be placed on the left side. And it's really this idea of balance that leads to our love of symmetrical photos. So what contributes to an image's visual weight? One thing that affects it is the size of the component. Naturally, a larger plate will have more visual weight than a smaller plate. And this size, of course, only really matters on the 2D plane. So imagine you're looking at a flat lay, even though it might contain more volume, it might be deeper. But on a 2D plane, a plate might be wider, and so it would be considered to have more visual weight. Another thing is texture. Plain white plates will have less weight than plates with a more intricate pattern. Matte silverware will contain more visual weight than glossy, smooth silverware. Basically, complexities and interest will create more visual weight. Also, note that, and this might seem obvious, but things in focus will have more visual weight than things out of focus. In general, anything that catches the eye more will have more visual weight. Finally, this doesn't really affect the object's weight per se, but it's important to note that objects on the side, the very side of the image, will definitely have more of an effect than objects closer to the center, right? Just like a balance or an actual seesaw. Then we have dimensions. This is especially important in food photography. When you're composing your shot, you need to be aware of all 3 dimensions. Obviously, there should be components along the x-axis, but also think about how you can create diversity in the y-axis. Start creating layers and variations through height differences. And then think about the z-axis. Put things behind and in front of each other, creating that depth and immersion. This is why frame within frame is a great technique. Not only does it focus the viewer's eye on your subject, but it creates multiple layers and depth. It's also why landscape photographers will have this need to find foreground. Recently, I've also seen some great foreground being utilized by some food photographers, although I personally haven't taken any photos like this with a foreground. But I am looking forward to trying it out because it definitely does give a nice enhancement to the photo. And finally, one last but important thing to pay attention to is if your photo is natural or not. All of what I previously mentioned are great. They're great concepts to keep in mind. But if to the untrained eye, it's super obvious that you're doing some kind of technique, it will take your viewer out of the photo. Your viewer will start paying attention to the technique rather than the photo itself, rather than the food that you're photographing. Imagine I wanted to photograph some Chinese food and I had chopsticks. Well, the obvious thing, because I have this idea of leading lines, I would just point all the chopsticks at my main subject, Chinese food. But that would seem odd. No one actually uses chopsticks that way, and it will take the viewer out of the photo and see, oh, he's trying to point at the main subject. But now your viewer is paying attention to chopsticks, and so all is for nothing. That's why you have the rule of thirds. It seems unintentional. If you have something right in the middle, it just seems very overused and obvious. So quick recap. We talked about selecting your main subject, we talked about the eye's journey, we talked about balance, we talked about dimensions, and finally we talked about naturalness. In food photography, you have a blank canvas. Now, a lot of photographers will tell you that it's opposite from drawing and painting, that you don't have a blank canvas, that opposed to drawing, that you're not adding on into the frame, you're reducing the frame, you're trying to minimalize what's in the frame. And that's true with street photography, landscape, candid portraits, but in food photography, especially if you're in your own studio, you do start with a blank canvas. You start with your own backdrop, and slowly following these fundamentals of composition, you add on your main subject, your secondary subjects, different components, your props, and then slowly one by one, you create your image, you create your piece of work. And that is how to think of composition. If you watched this far, I hope it's because it was useful, and it'd be great if you could click that like button. It helps with the algorithm. Thank you. And if you want more food photography tutorials, consider subscribing. And see you next week. Goodbye.